Well, good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Welcome to another AUBER Roundtable, our series of online presentations and discussions dealing with timely and important regional economic issues produced by the Association for University Business and Economic Research. My name is Patrick Barkey, and I direct the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Montana. It's also my privilege to serve as AUBER president this year. AUBER is the premier professional organization for university-based and other regional economic centers around the United States. We were established in 1947, and since that time, we've grown to include centers from leading universities, privately based centers, and government agencies. You can find out more about who we are and what we do by visiting our website, auber.org. Today's roundtable takes up a topic that has state capitals around the country buzzing, and that's the rapidly changing fiscal status of state governments. We put together an outstanding group of presenters to give their perspectives on this timely topic. To introduce and kick off our program as moderator, we have joining us Juliet Tennert, Director of Economic and Policy and Director of Economic and Public Policy at the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. Juliet specializes in Utah's economy, forecasting, modeling, and fiscal policy analysis. She's previously served as state budget director for the governor of Utah and is also in other leadership roles in state government. She's also AUBER vice president. Juliet, the program is yours.
All right, well, thank you so much, Pat, for that great introduction. It is my pleasure to moderate our first roundtable of 2021. I've just been as I prepared for this roundtable, I've been reflecting about over the last 12 months, and what a wild year it's been. It felt like the world turned upside down as the COVID-19 pandemic took hold last March and April. And at that point, the outlook seemed pretty dismal in those initial months, with state and local governments anticipating billions of dollars of deficits. Now, things have kind of changed since then, with massive federal fiscal stimulus and varying paths of economic impacts, and then various paths of economic recovery. There are some states that are finding themselves with unexpected revenue surpluses. So today we're going to do a deeper dive into all of these really interesting dynamics that are at play with three very distinguished experts. I'm going to just save the time for them to talk as opposed to going through their full bios. You can find their bios online at auber.org. And also on auber.org, you can see a list of past roundtables with recordings. And then you'll also want to keep an eye on that website for future roundtables. So Kathryn Vesey White is joining us today. She's the Director of Budget Process Studies for the National Association of State Budget Officers. Kathryn is going to give us kind of like a state of state budgets. So we're going to take a look at just the overall landscape that states were operating in and currently are operating in. Then we're excited to hear from Jason Saving, a senior economist with the Dallas Federal Reserve. Jason's going to provide us with some insights on fiscal policy as it relates to states and some lessons learned from the Great Recession. And then finally, I'm excited to hear from Kate Watkins. Kate is the chief economist to the Colorado State Legislature. And Kate's going to help us really see how all of these things have played out in a practical sense at the state level. So each panelist will present for between 10 and 15 minutes, which will reserve us some time for a Q&A at the end of this, at the end. I would ask that you just be patient. We'll take all the questions at the end just to give our panelists the full amount of time to share all the interesting information that they've pulled together for us. But if you have a question that comes up as one of our panelists is speaking, please go ahead and enter that into the Q&A function in Zoom, and then I'll present those questions to the panelists once they're finished. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn our time over to the program And Kathryn, let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Juliet. And thank you all for having me here with you today virtually. Just a quick introduction to NASBO, the National Association of State Budget Officers. We are the professional membership organization for governors, budget, and finance officers. And so we were fortunate, for example, to have Juliet as a member during her time as budget director of Utah. So as Juliet said, I'm going to run through a pretty quick overview of the state budget landscape, just to help set the stage for today's roundtable. Next slide, please. So this here is sort of a roadmap and I don't know if the slides are showing up well for everyone else. They're looking a little cut off to me, or is that just on my end?
You know what, we are getting actually some feedback from our participants saying that the slides are cut off. And so maybe we'll see if we can get those fixed. Something weird is going on.
Well, you know, while you're looking at that, I can speak to what's on the first slide there because it is mostly content, you know, not really the quantitative data yet. So it's not really essential to be seeing it.
Thanks, Kathryn.
Sure. So really today I'm going to talk a little bit about where we've been, you know, since the pandemic started in terms of state finances, where we are now, and a little bit about where we're going. As states put their budgets together last year for fiscal year 21, just as the pandemic was hitting, states were really seeing, you know, the revenues plummet due to COVID-19 and the sudden drop in economic activity due to public health precautions. And states saw at that time, they saw revenue decline for fiscal year 2020 for the first time in the aggregate after 9 consecutive years of aggregate growth. And greater declines were forecasted by states, in some cases quite severe, for fiscal year 21. And in response to these weakening revenue projections, states enacted budgets for fiscal year 2021 called for the first general fund spending decrease since the Great Recession. Now, since that time, as was mentioned in the introduction, we've seen, thankfully, that revenues in many states have fared better, in some cases considerably so, compared to those dire projections from earlier in the crisis. And certainly the impact of federal stimulus played a huge role in this, as well as some other factors that we'll get into a little more later. However, not all states have seen the same level of improvement in their forecasts, and the pandemic's impact has been notably uneven across the states and largely has been dependent on differing economies and tax structures. But needless to say, these rapidly changing fiscal conditions in the states have made state budgeting an even more challenging task than usual. So we'll get into all of those points a little bit more in the time remaining. Next slide, please. And so did the next slide advance? Well, I'll start just talking. There we go. It might just be a little delayed. So I'm going to run through some of our latest 50 state data, but I'll do so fairly quickly, in part, frankly, because much of this data is out of date already, given how quickly conditions have changed in recent months. So the data in this presentation comes from NASBO's Fall 2020 Fiscal Survey of States, which we released in December, but the data was collected mostly in early fall of last year. So on the revenue side, as shown here, general fund revenues declined 1.6% in fiscal year 2020 across the states compared to fiscal year 2019. And this was, as I said, the first decline recorded since the Great Recession, specifically since fiscal year 2010. Our report showed steeper declines were expected in fiscal year 2021 based on the most current revenue estimates Available at the time of data collection, states were projecting general fund revenue declines of another 4.4% for what is now the current fiscal year for states, 2021, or with the exception of New York, which just started its fiscal year 22 today. These figures are not adjusted to account for those states that recognize some revenue in fiscal year 21 instead of 20 due to the tax deadline shift, which just created another complication for state revenue forecasting during an already very uncertain time. And this delay in the tax deadline tended to deflate fiscal year 2020 revenue for some states and inflate it for 2021, depending on how states recognize those delayed payments. Next slide, please. And so this next chart here shows how general fund revenues reported in our fiscal survey compared to states' pre-pandemic projections, because of course states don't budget assuming flat or no growth, but budget based on projected growth. And so before the crisis hit, states were expecting annual general fund revenue growth of about 3% in fiscal year 20 and again in fiscal year 21. So compared to those pre-COVID projections, fiscal year 20 general fund collections declined by almost 4%. And in fiscal year 21, the most current estimates when data were collected showed a decline of almost 11%. Now, even while some states' revenue forecasts have improved since this data was collected, most states are still seeing revenue coming in below their pre-pandemic forecasts. Next slide. Now to turn to the spending side of the equation, states' enacted budgets for fiscal year 21 were projected to reduce general fund spending by year over year by 1.1%, which would mark the first time states enacted a net spending decrease in more than a decade, once again since fiscal year 2010. Next slide. Now, when you compare enacted spending plans to governor's budget proposals for fiscal year 21, which were released by most states just a few months earlier before the pandemic hit, the decline is much greater. So enacted budgets showed a decline of 5.5% compared to what had been proposed prior to the pandemic. Next slide. This next slide shows, it's just another indicator we look at, and 19 states reported making net mid-year general fund budget cuts in fiscal year 2020 due to a revenue shortfall. But what this graph also shows is how state fiscal stress, as indicated by mid-year budget cuts, tends to persist even after recessions technically end. The recessions here are shown in sort of those grayish boxes. And this is due to the lagging nature of how an economic downturn typically affects state tax collections and also the timing of when states make budget decisions. But of course, the COVID-19 recession and recovery are not necessarily your typical recession. And so it will be interesting to see this time around what happens in the coming years, given the faster recovery that may be expected, and we'll go into a little more about that, and the large federal stimulus flowing into the economy. Next slide. So states overall did turn to a number of strategies to manage their budgets and address shortfalls in 20 and 21. To reduce spending, they enacted program spending cuts, personnel actions like hiring freezes or furloughs, certainly turned as well to one-time measures to balance budgets, such as tapping rainy day funds, which had been built to an all-time high coming into this crisis by states. And only a couple of states reported using revenue increases to help close budgets. Some states also reported using federal assistance to offset some general fund eligible costs related to the pandemic. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about now, many states released and enacted budgets for this current year based on revenue estimates from the past, from last spring, when the scale of the crisis was really just beginning to be understood and the uncertainty was at a peak. And those projections showed severe revenue declines of 20% or more in some cases. And since that time, those states have still seen the pandemic's negative impacts on their revenues, but not to the extent predicted. And there's a few reasons why, to explain why this occurred. So federal stimulus certainly pumped a lot of money into the economy already, and more is coming. And this has helped mitigate state revenue loss and helped stave off a more severe recession. Another factor is that the recession has disproportionately affected low-income workers, given the nature of the pandemic and how it has affected economic activity and employment. So high-income earners, mostly those able to work from home, have been relatively insulated, and this has not hurt state income taxes as much as was initially predicted. State sales tax-based broadening efforts leading up to this crisis were another mitigating factor, particularly the online sales tax collection that was enabled in states after the Wayfair court decision. Also, the pandemic has largely curtailed consumption of services that many states don't tax as much, while consumption of goods, which are more likely to be taxed by states, have been less affected by the pandemic. So these are just some of the reasons to explain why revenues improved compared to what was feared earlier in the crisis. Next slide. But the aggregate figures on state fiscal conditions can obscure to some extent that certain states are really feeling the impacts of the pandemic on their revenues. So while the pandemic has hit all states, the extent of the impact is highly dependent on a state's economy and tax structure. States that are particularly dependent on tourism and leisure, the energy sector, and other areas that have been hardest hit by the pandemic, as well as those states generally facing higher unemployment rates, are tending to see larger impacts on their economies and their tax revenues as a result of the pandemic. Also, tax structures have played a key role, and many of the points discussed on the previous slide regarding how differing tax revenue streams have been affected really apply here when thinking about why some states are feeling the pinch more than others. The disproportionate impacts on low-income workers that I just discussed also is contributing to unevenness across the states. States that may have had higher poverty levels coming into this crisis may find themselves in a tougher budget situations. And also just this reality is also putting additional strain on the spending side of state budgets as states are seeing a growing need for social assistance programs. Next slide. So just to sum up the overall outlook for state budgets as we see it, states are continuing to face ongoing uncertainty about their revenue outlook as they put their budgets together for fiscal year 22, just given how quickly things have changed and continue to change. But the overall outlook has improved compared to this time last year. Recent revenue forecasts are more optimistic than expected. But as mentioned previously, revenues are still below their pre-pandemic projections, and the situation is uneven across the states. Pent-up demand, a high savings rate, more federal stimulus are all expected to result in a faster and more robust recovery. But at the same time, rising spending demands are expected to continue to put pressure on state budgets. And as we review governors' budget proposals and actions during states' legislative sessions that are going on right now, budget priorities in the states can currently include, helping those most affected by the pandemic, using both state and federal funds, investing in infrastructure and workforce training, addressing inequities that have been exacerbated by this pandemic, and ensuring long-term fiscal stability, especially as they budget for how to spend the federal funds coming out of the various stimulus packages, including the most recent American Rescue Plan, spending those funds most effectively without setting themselves up for a fiscal cliff once that money runs out. So with just a couple minutes remaining in my segment, if you could turn to the next slide. I was just going to briefly run through where some of our main publications that NASBO puts out. The fall fiscal survey I mentioned is where the data that I just reviewed came from. We put this fiscal survey out twice a year, and the spring edition focuses on governor's budgets. So we'll be putting out one focused on 22 governor's budgets in a couple months. Next slide. And our state expenditure report, released annually, looks at spending across all program areas and fund sources, whereas the fiscal survey is really focused on the general fund. Next slide. And finally, one more report I wanted to put a plug in for is our budget processes in the states report. Provides 50 state data on various facets of states' budget processes and how they differ across the states. And it was last updated in 2015, but a new edition of the report is actually going to be coming out in a matter of weeks. So be on the lookout for that this spring. Next slide. We really did, to that point, see an increased attention and interest in state budget processes over the last year. States' budget calendars, revenue forecasting procedures, varying levels of gubernatorial budget authority. These all played key roles in determining how and when states took budget action in response to the pandemic. And we're now even seeing some states taking action to change these processes as a result of their experience during the pandemic. So it'll really be interesting to see how all this plays out. And maybe we'll have to update the report again a little quicker this time. So with that, I will turn things over to Jason.
Great. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much. And I've just got to say, I mean, maybe we were just tempting fate by talking state budgets on April Fool's Day. So thanks so much for dealing with the little bits of technical difficulty, and also for pointing out those really great resources that NASBO shares that are available, free open access to the public on your website. I appreciate that. Great. All right. And I think we'll get the slides up and ready for Jason and let you to it, Jason. Thanks so much.
All right, well, thank you, Juliet. And I just want to throw in a little unsolicited plug that those NASBO publications are truly excellent for those who are not familiar with them, but might be curious about budgeting, taxing, spending. They're really, really useful. So I want to start by just letting everyone know I do work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Nothing I say here should be attributed to the bank or the system. So these are just my views alone. And I want to try to bring in a little bit of historical perspective from the Great Recession, and then leave all of you guys who are listening with what I think is a key question of, are things different this time? Are there reasons to think that the lessons we learned from the Great Recession, maybe they don't apply this time after all? Next slide, please. So when COVID initially struck, just about every state saw tax revenue plunging in those first few months. One example is Texas, where I am based. Looking at the April 2020, it's just hit, we're sort of imploding as an economy. We saw our monthly tax revenue fall by half compared to April of 2019. Now, Juliet's smile confirms that this is not like a representative month or anything else. I don't mean to say that it was, but you're sort of hitting the panic button at that particular point in time, thinking, my gosh, what is going to happen for the rest of the year, given what's just happened in April? So it's not representative, but the fiscal picture in a lot of states and localities does remain very uncertain. Next slide, please. Well, why does this even matter? Well, it matters for people who might be seeking government services. It matters for firms who might need government assistance, or your sales as a firm are depending on individuals having the fiscal wherewithal to be able to buy your products. It matters for all of us as taxpayers, because ultimately, let's not kid ourselves. Anything government spends, we've got to pay for eventually. And much as we might like to imagine that deficit finance spending can just come because Santa Claus bestows it, it is a transfer from the future to the present that eventually will have to be paid for. So these decisions that we make are really important for everybody. Next slide, please. Now I want to get into lessons from the Great Recession and why I think they matter for all of us today. Next slide, please. To answer this question, I need to go back and just briefly talk about why are governments fiscally stretched at all during recessions? Well, two main reasons. Number one is that when recession strikes, demand for government services naturally goes up because people find themselves with less income than they had before. Maybe they've gotten fired. Maybe they're working fewer hours. Maybe it's a two-earner family, but one earner has gotten terminated. So I'll put all those things together, and it means more of us need help, and each of us per capita need more help than we'd usually need. But secondly, tax revenue falls because fewer people are working, so there's less income, but also less production is taking place. So output in the economy and firm revenue is going down. Next slide, please. So, all right, we know that business cycles are going to happen, that there are going to be ups, there are going to be downs. What would an econ textbook say that you ought to do during the business cycle? Well, what it would say is you need to run surpluses during expansions, which would then be spent down during recessions. Sort of like the biblical example of Joseph in Egypt, stockpiling food, because he knows eventually famine's going to come, and when it does, we better be prepared instead of not being prepared. So that's the orthodox public finance prescription. What do we really do for the most part, both federally and in states? Well, we spend surpluses during expansion, deficit spend or shortfall spend, I guess we ought to say for states, while sort of pretending that there was no way we could have foreseen that there'd ever be a downturn, or if there were, that there'd be a fiscal crunch at a federal, state, or local level. Maybe that was a little blunt, but nevertheless, it's typically how we sort of do business. So at the federal level, this can more or less work because an unlimited amount of deficit spending is permitted. But at the state and local level, where we largely asterisk can't deficit spend, it doesn't work as well, although we could have a whole session on the many tips and tricks that you can do for finding ways to categorize spending where that would look a lot like deficit spending to just sort of a casual observer who would be looking at things. Next slide, please. Well, naturally, based on what I just said, you might think that fiscal shortfalls are going to emerge during the downturn part of a business cycle. So, and we'll talk about rainy day funds in about 2 minutes. So I'm actually getting to this question, so great. So this causes fiscal shortfalls to emerge, but let's see how much. Next slide, please. So this shows you aggregate fiscal shortfalls across the 50 states as a share of general revenue during some tough years. 2002 to 5, the downturn we had then, 2009, 10, 11, 12, so the Great Recession. And you can see that in the worst year of the Great Recession, budget-wise, which was 2010, I guess economy-wise, probably 2009, but we sort of lag a bit because of tax revenue and the like. So 2010, like 15% of general revenue. This is very, very large. And you probably remember that we saw significant tax increases, spending cuts. Well, that 15% is why we saw those. Well, I guess I could belabor this more, but the slide sort of speaks for itself. So next slide, please. So the way in which individual states decide to raise their revenue impacts their business cycle exposure, whether you'd expect them to have a yawning gap of 15, 20, 25% of general revenue, or whether you'd expect them to have maybe a 5 or 10% gap. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's consider 2009. Sales tax receipts across the 50 states fell by about 4%. Individual income tax receipts for states fell about 12%. And corporate income tax receipts fell just over 22% in that year, 2009. Why? Well, very simply, consumption varies a lot less than income over the course of the business cycle. So taxes, the tax income, are naturally going to fall much more than consumption taxes like a sales tax would. So this is pretty typical of most recessions that we go into, not the exact numbers, of course, but the general trend of sales taxes holding up much better than income taxes do. Now, to be sure, there are questions about regressivity that are profound and important and worth thinking about, though there's not time to address those questions here. So what this means is that if you as a state decide to have a mix of taxes that you know are going to be highly volatile over the course of the business cycle, it would make sense for you to have large rainy day fund balances because you know you're going to need them. So essentially what this would mean is that a state like Texas ought to have an extremely low rainy day fund balance, whereas Illinois, New York, New Jersey should have very, very high rainy day fund balances because they know what will happen during recession. So let's see whether this trend that makes sense holds up in the data. And yes to this question, absolutely. Relying on the sales tax makes you much more regressive, not a little more, much more. And that is worth talking about. If I had 5 more minutes or 10 more, I would do it here, but I don't. But yes, the questioner is correct. Next slide, please. So do we see this reflected? Let's find out. Next slide, please. Well, we do indeed see Texas on one side, New York, New Jersey, Illinois on the other, but the problem is it's flipped compared to what we talked about 2 minutes ago. Of these states, Texas has by far the largest rainy day fund balance, even though it needs a rainy day fund less. Whereas New York, 3%, New Jersey, 1%, Illinois, 0.0% of the revenue stream. They need it the most based on economic theory. They have the least. So we don't really see, at least as a general trend, states doing what we talked about a couple of slides ago. Next slide, please. So that might make you wonder, and this is my concluding slide, though there are a few thoughts that I want to make sure to lay out. You might wonder, well, gosh, that must mean that these other states are in a real pickle this time as well. Well, what's different this time is that these large stimulus payments, supports for states, localities, individual balance sheets through the stimulus payments and the like, what we've seen is that personal income has held up much better in the COVID era than it did during the Great Recession, or really any other recession with which I am familiar. So what does that mean? That means that state income tax revenue has held up much better than it usually would. We saw in the last presentation that the difference is something like 4% versus 6%, rather than 4% versus 12 to 15%. So income taxes have held up much better at the state level than they typically would. Now, the question is, and this will be the very last point that I make in the presentation, What does this mean for the future? Have we established a new template for handling recessions where the federal government is going to take a historically unprecedented role just every time there's a recession and bolster income in a way it never has before? If it does, then banking like, say, California would, or New York or in Illinois, on individual and corporate revenue holding up, that might be a much less risky gamble than it would have been during past recessions. But if this is not a template, and during the next recession, the federal government goes back to its ordinary way of doing business, then once again, states that rely very heavily on income taxes, we can expect to need to do much more drastic fiscal adjustments in the next recession, as they had to during the Great Recession. So I don't have an answer to this question because none of us can know what the federal government's going to do next time. And as a Federal Reserve economist, I'm taking no position on which one to do next time. But I do think this is the crucial question with which state policymakers are confronted as they try to decide what lessons should we learn from this specific COVID recession. And I will stop there, having raised these questions with few answers. But thanks for the invitation. I appreciate all of you.
Excellent. Jason, thank you so much. And just looking at the information that Kathryn provided, looking at the information that you've provided, I think that we could do, a day-long seminar, a week-long seminar in any of these things. And so thank you for doing such a wonderful job of really consolidating all of these really important points and also leaving us with some food for thought for the future. Now we'll turn the time over to Kate Watkins.
Thanks so much, Julia. And I'm not currently able to show my video, but I think we can re-enable that, and I'll bring. If I could also share slides, that would be awesome. I know I'm a high maintenance panelist right now.
That's great. All right, are you able to? Are you seeing the ability to share?
Not yet.
Okay.
But I'll provide a little bit of an introduction as we're getting this worked out. Kate Watkins, I'm the chief economist for Colorado State Legislature and lead a team of 6 revenue forecasters, essentially. So we've been essentially trying to forecast and make sense of the pandemic in real time and understand and project what that actually means for state revenue. So much of the slides that you'll be seeing today really reflect kind of what we've been seeing in basically over the course of the last year. So if we can go to the next slide. So a little bit just in terms of context about Colorado's specific institutional and budget structure. Colorado currently both chambers, both House and Senate, are controlled by Democrats. Additionally, the governor is also a Democrat. So just in terms of political context, thought that might be relevant. Colorado is unique in that it has what's called the Tabor Amendment, or the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, constitutional amendment that limits the amount of revenue that the state can retain and spend, and also requires voter approval for any tax increases, among other provisions. So it provides some context that might come into play a little bit later in the presentation. Third, Colorado has a balanced budget requirement, can't spend more than the money that it takes in. And finally, Colorado lacks a true rainy day fund. We do have a general fund reserve. That's essentially the amount of revenue left over at the end of the year, but we don't have any constraints on that other than the requirement to have a certain amount left over at the end of the year. But historically, that amount has actually been reduced below zero or to zero in some instances. So not a true rainy day fund. In terms of some of the institutional and kind of budget specific structures, Colorado has a 6-member joint budget committee that largely determines the budget in the state. And it also has quarterly revenue forecasts. So some states have annual revenue forecasts, some biannual. In our instance, it's once a quarter. And we have 2 sort of dueling forecasts, one presented by my office, another by the governor's staff. And next slide. So back in May, we did something that our office has never done before, in that we departed from our quarterly revenue forecast and actually did one extra forecast, in that we presented a forecast in March literally as the economy was shutting down. So that being the case, wanted to provide something that we thought would be more useful to the legislature in determining the budget for what is now the current year. These are our forecast projections from that May forecast update. And you can see sizable declines consistent with what we saw over the past 2 business cycles. So basically, top to bottom, similar percentage declines relative to the Great Recession and the early 2000s recession. What actually transpired turned out to be something very different, which we'll see here shortly. I'm showing you here gross general fund revenue. That's and of course, states receive other sources of funds, namely cash funds, which tend to go towards fee-based, that tend to go towards certain programs, and then federal funds. But general funds are the most flexible sources of funds for Colorado, and I imagine other states as well, which is why it's receiving kind of more attention here. And next slide. So the composition of general funds in the state of Colorado largely come from income tax and individual income tax in particular. Colorado now has a 4.55% income tax rate that applies to both flat tax, applies to both corporate and individuals. And that's the lion's share of general fund revenue. So any volatility, it is the most volatile source of general fund revenue, and any volatility, it's going to be large because it makes up such a large share. Sales and use tax also make up a significant chunk of general fund revenue, but again, income tax is the bulk of it. And next slide. So what we saw over the course of the pandemic, really was something remarkable, not anything that any of us expected as we were going into this pandemic situation. And it really was unlike any other recession. And you can see this in these 2 charts showing sales tax collections and individual income tax withholding collections as well. So starting with sales tax, you can see that super quick rebound highlighted in the sort of gray bars to the far right. And you can compare that to the Great Recession, sort of that 2008 to 2010 time period, where it was long, protracted, continued declines, and it took years to get back up to pre-recessionary levels. During the pandemic recession, immediate bounce back. And some of that had to do with the shift in consumption. Well, one, during the shutdown, it was hard to consume. But once we could get out of our homes, well, actually, we didn't even need to get out of our homes, frankly, because we just boosted our online purchases. So that, and then coupled with that, we were reducing our consumption of services, but spending more on stuff, our home gyms, our pajama pants, whatever you might have purchased from Amazon or whatever online retailer, and that was delivered directly to your door. So bounced right back up to pre-pandemic levels. When it comes to income tax, we actually saw an acceleration in income tax collections, which is frankly remarkable. And that was for a couple of different reasons, but largely a result of what we have identified as 2 trends, one being a K-shaped recovery, which we'll go into here in the next slide, and then also the impacts of the stimulus. So walking through that a little bit more in the next slide. In terms of the K-shaped recovery, this chart shows data from Opportunity Insights, which is a cool collective that essentially takes real-time data, sort of big data, and gives us better real-time insights into what's going on in the economy than some of the published data that's out there from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So here you're seeing the change in the levels of employment across high, middle, and low income workers. And you can see that for high income workers, we got right back up to or near pre-pandemic levels very quickly. When it comes to middle and low income, certainly not the case. And those low income largely reflecting some of the drag from leisure and hospitality industries who have yet to return. So your bars, your restaurants, your hotels, for example. So this K-shaped recovery, why it matters for income tax revenues is that high income earners make up the lion's share of income tax collections. They're contributing most, and the Paycheck Protection Program kept some workers employed. That certainly, I imagine, helped here in bolstering incomes, but also just high income workers largely were able to go back to normal, well, maybe not normal, but they were able to shift their work practices to home without that impacting their wages. So largely not impacted. As a result, our income tax collections remain quite strong. The other piece, moving to the next slide, is just the massive amount of federal stimulus that was injected into the economy. So this slide is showing kind of a comparison of the Great Recession versus the COVID recession. That black line reflects personal income. So that's sort of your income across households in the US. The black line is income, including those transfer payments, the unemployment insurance, the direct payments to households in particular. And the blue line is without. So if not for the stimulus, would have seen a much more profound contraction in incomes. With the stimulus, a different story. So not only have those stimulus payments helped to bolster consumer activity, we believe, but also unemployment insurance in particular has helped to bolster the kind of impact of some of the low wage or any workers that have lost their jobs, bolster the tax collections from those individuals. In Colorado, unemployment insurance has been taxable. That might change with future policy changes, but at this time, it has been factored into the collections where it has been withheld and continues to boost those collections. Next slide. So what all of this has meant for Colorado's revenue situation is that we've gone from a revenue forecast of severe contractions to one of only minor contractions, and really those contractions concentrated in the current year. So right now we're expecting a 1.1% decline in the current fiscal year, followed by a fairly strong rebound in economic activity and revenue growth. One thing I want to highlight in this slide, because it factors into the next couple, is that revenue came in much stronger last year than expected. And so we sort of had to rebase, so to speak. So what that means in kind of geeky budget wonk talk is that we increased our expectations across all years, in part because 2019 income tax collections, which reflect pre-pandemic activity, came in so much stronger. So that FY 19-20 is really reflecting economic activity from the past, from pre-pandemic. Next slide. So I wanted to show you kind of, geek out a little bit more and show you the progression of the change in our revenue forecast, as well as some policy changes that have really essentially brought us from a $3.3 billion deficit to almost a $3 billion surplus. So back in May, we were projecting a $3.3 billion deficit. That's given, and that's based on a scenario. So basically the General Assembly had not yet set a budget. And so what we do is provide a scenario that gives them a feel for how much money they have relative to current year spending. So what that scenario does is hold appropriations constant, because they haven't yet set those appropriations. So we're just saying, if you hold appropriations constant, you're going to have a $3.3 billion deficit when it comes to your revenue relative to spending. So that's to put a little more context on that 3.3. Over the course, and this slide, I'll back up a little bit. This slide shows the general fund reserve. So this is essentially our rainy day fund, if you were to say that we had one. And it is the money that's left over. It's the last dollar in. It's the money left over at the end of the year. And you can see the just improvements that have been really quite remarkable over the last year, over the last year of our quarterly forecasts. So to walk through some of those changes, when they did set a budget, instead of holding appropriations constant, the appropriations were set at $1.28 billion lower than last year's amounts. So that significantly reduced the deficit, but there was still a long ways to go. They also reduced transfers from the general fund, and the reserve requirement went from 7.25 down to this required 2.86%. Beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, collections last year came in much better than expected, reflecting economic activity of the past. That boosted the beginning balance by $1.8 billion. So that was a huge impact. It was huge in impacting, basically reducing that deficit. And finally, we've continued to increase our revenue expectations for a number of different reasons. One on the vaccine distribution, one on federal stimulus, for example, but lots of improvement there, also just stronger than expected collections. And next slide. And I know we're growing short on time, so I'll kind of buzz through this pretty quickly. Essentially, the outlook for next year has also improved remarkably. And this, again, we have to use an assumption because they haven't yet set a budget. So this holds appropriations constant at recessionary levels, essentially. But the amount of money they have to work with next year is much stronger than expected, certainly back in May. So next slide kind of ties the last couple of years together, but with some caveats. So what this slide does is shows the total amount of general fund spending and saving. So your spending would be the appropriations and rebates and expenditures, transfers in the dark blue, and then anything in the gold would be what's left over, your reserve. And essentially that excess reserve has been carried forward each year. Had they spent it, it's one-time money, it wouldn't exist. You'd have to take that chunk of the bar out of that year and any subsequent years. So basically, in not spending the revenue that has come in, the General Assembly finds itself in a pretty good situation when it comes to this money left over, this rainy day fund, so to speak. But that said, it is one-time money. Next slide. So do want to highlight just ongoing risks. I'm not going to detail all of these, but the pandemic continues to evolve. We think we're through the worst, but that could change. But we're still learning a lot about income tax collections in particular, and that we're all now or soon will be filing our annual returns. And based on those, that's when we'll finally get a feel for what happened in 2020. So still a lot to learn even about what happened during the pandemic. Overall, we do view risks as skewed to the upside, meaning because collections continue to exceed expectations, we continue to see those upside surprises. And if anything, we think we're going to collect more. In Colorado, because we have the Tabor limit, that doesn't mean a whole lot for a change in the budget situation, and that we can't keep that additional money beyond the Tabor limit. And last slide. So what is the General Assembly going to do with this excess, the surplus at the end of the year? What does this mean? That currently they're considering a number of different options, but one is essentially holding on to the money, in part because of the uncertainty, and in part because historically Colorado hasn't had a rainy day fund or a huge reserve in order to cushion some of the downfalls in revenue. So that is something under consideration. A boost, sort of state stimulus via infrastructure spending or relief to businesses and those most affected by the pandemic. There are a number of different sort of bills that target that that are under consideration. So all of that is a one-time impact on the budget and would play to the kind of one-time impact, not only of this general fund kind of excess reserve, but also the federal stimulus, the federal aid to states that's coming in through the American Rescue Plan. So Colorado is expected to get somewhere around $3.9 billion in federal stimulus on top of this budget situation that it finds itself in. In terms of ongoing spending options, one is to restore K-12 education spending to pre-pandemic levels. K-12, because it makes up a large share of the general fund budget, it did get a sizable cut, or shrinking that the spending for K-12 was in large part how they kind of solved the state deficit problem. So restoring that funding would be one option. And then one other wild card is that there is a possibility that we'll see income tax rate reductions on the ballot in November. So that would be just a across the board cut in revenue moving forward. This past November, the income tax rate was reduced, but this is one additional way that we might kind of change our budget situation. So thank you so much, and looking forward to the questions.
All right. Well, thank you. I truly appreciate all of the excellent information. It was so nice to see from Kathryn just kind of a general lay of the land and looking at the variation of impacts across states, and then moving into Jason and kind of getting some reasoning for the varying impact, and then Kate for just to see the deep dive into the dynamics at play at Colorado to put it all in place in a really real kind of a scenario was quite helpful. So thank you for that. So we have scheduled to go to 10 minutes past the hour. So we do have a little bit of time for questions. I have a feeling that we will have to probably cut off and not have time to really, do the great discussion or deep discussion that all of this excellent information warrants. So I would just say that the AUBER listserv is a great place to have those types of conversations. And if we don't get to the point where we're answering all of the questions, like definitely use that resource to have some conversations among colleagues. So with that, let's turn to, I saw popping up in both the Q&A and in the chat, seems like people have kind of glommed on to rainy day funds as something interesting in all of this, many interesting things, but it definitely is kind of an interesting point to be looking at, and how states are using rainy day funds in reaction to these economic shocks and recessions. And so George Hammond from Arizona says, it doesn't appear that states are relying or did rely much on their rainy day funds. Why not draw those funds down in response to a recession, whether it be a pandemic shock or just a business cycle type recession? Why don't we see states drawing those funds down first and then targeting cuts later? And I think it's a good question. Maybe, Kathryn, do you want to maybe take a stab just from your kind of perspective of looking at all states, kind of help us kind of think through why we see that dynamic?
Sure, yeah, and then welcome others if there's anything to fill in. So from our vantage point, because we do get this question a lot, and certainly one really broad rationale for why states try not to rely heavily on the rainy day funds, especially early in a crisis, is that especially when there is a lot of uncertainty about how long it's going to go on for, you don't want to drain them too quickly, but B, the more you rely on a one-time tool like that to balance, the harder it will make budgeting the following year. And so what we often will see is states using the rainy day fund as one tool, but also pairing that with some spending reductions or some other more ongoing ways of achieving savings and balancing. But another point I would just make, looking at state by state data is we saw particularly, and the data is still, incomplete since this is an ongoing situation, that states did tap rainy day funds, but very unevenly. So some states completely depleted or drew down heavily from their reserves, whereas many others did not use them at all, or in fact even saw slight bumps in their rainy day funds. And a lot of that really speaks to the uneven impacts of the pandemic. And also just, as Jason noted during his presentation, rainy day fund levels across the states coming into this crisis were uneven. And so, not all states had the same capacity, to turn to their reserves, just depending on their levels. And I think I think this was brought up a little bit in the chat, so I could quickly touch on it as well. When looking at state-specific data, one thing to just keep in mind too is some states do have a reliance as well on their other reserves or general fund balances that don't show up in the rainy day fund. And we could have a long discussion about the pros and cons of that, but some of the states that may show up as having pretty small rainy day fund balances may historically carry pretty large balances in their general funds. That is, and Colorado's a good example of a state, as Kate talked about, that strictly relies on its general fund balance, but there are other states that have some combination of the two. So
excellent, thank you. I think that was really helpful insight. Kate, Jason, do you have anything to add on kind of that dynamic?
Well, I would simply add that, it was a great, very thorough explanation. Sometimes a state or a locality might be worried about its credit rating for putting out, new bonds, et cetera. And you might fear the smaller that account goes, the farther you fall from AAA into something else. So that can be a concern. Plus, if you don't know if this is going to be a multi-year downturn, maybe for a while you feared 2021 or 2022 might be worse than 2020. You might fear to draw it down completely, only to really be in a pickle. But that's all that I would add.
And I would, great overview. I would add, just sometimes it's the political optics where if everyone else in the economy is suffering, then why shouldn't state government also not suffer, but also, kind of tighten up its belt. One potential factor is that states maybe didn't have to, in some instances, draw down the funds because revenue was coming in stronger than expected. And then in the case of Colorado, because it's the general fund balance and we have to have a balanced budget, there really, given all of the uncertainty that was going on in revenue, it just seemed to make sense to make cuts just in case things were even worse than what we were expecting in May or thereafter.
Excellent. I feel like I get to take moderator's privilege here. As a former state budget director, I also just, adding in and kind of thinking about the way we saw this play out with state policy preferences and, again, kind of political sensitivities. I think that's sometimes at some time at play. Also, just the timing of the impacts often, I think, will kind of influence the decision of drawing those rainy day funds. And so I think it was in Jason's presentation, we saw where, for example, the impacts of the Great Recession really hit state budgets. And so it actually comes a little bit after the recession happens or is winding down. And sometimes, again, depending on policymaker preference, sometimes it makes sense to save those rainy day funds or use of those rainy day funds for just as you're coming out of the recession and kind of helping to support that recovery. And Kate, as you mentioned, in some cases, at least this time around, it almost didn't end up being necessary. In the state of Utah, we're sitting at about $1 billion in rainy day funds now. The state legislature did authorize use of $100 million in rainy day funds to help the FY20 budget if there was a revenue shortfall, but the revenue shortfall did not materialize. And so, and maybe from a policy perspective, it makes sense to use those rainy day funds sooner rather than later in just a really crazy or wild shock like the pandemic, as opposed to waiting. But again, thanks for letting me. This is the three on the call with me. We had a great planning call last week, and it's so fun to just nerd out on public finance issues with you all. Let's move on. Just time's really limited, so we'll wrap up with this one point. And I think it is interesting to kind of think about how the impacts have taken hold and how the recovery has taken hold on the income side. And Jason, you talked about this, and we have a question about the stimulus payments themselves, but I think maybe you can help address this question a little bit more broadly as well. So are the stimulus payments non-taxable? Well, then how do they help income tax revenue stabilize these fiscal, how are those stimulus payments helping to stabilize the situation through way of income? And so maybe you can help us understand that taxability issue, but then also more generally, how is it that supporting kind of household income, business income, how is that playing out in terms of stabilization?
So sure, I'll take a stab at that, and then maybe the other panelists can bail me out for whatever I mess up or get wrong. So it's correct that a lot of the support the federal government has provided is non-taxable, though I'm not a tax attorney, so please don't take my advice alone for any of this. The main way that it feeds through to income tax revenue is the stuff that you'd be buying using that money. You buy stuff. When you buy stuff, more economic activity happens. Firms hire more people. They produce more products. By hiring more people, there's more personal income in the economy. So it's not a completely direct process, but indirectly, it does bolster individual revenue and also corporate revenue, because as a couple of our presentations showed, corporate income tax revenue can also fall by a lot. It's not just individual income tax revenue. So both of those get propped up somewhat indirectly because of these stimulus payments.
All right. Well, thank you. And I think, given where we are on time, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. I thank you all, Kathryn, Kate, Jason, for joining us with all this excellent information. Hopefully you'll be okay if we share slides. We'll follow up to get your direct permission, but we'll plan to share your slides when we get that permission with those that have participated on this call. I also want to thank Lisa Goodpaster from Ball State University, who's helped us out tremendously with all of the technology. And Lisa, we always appreciate you kind of bailing us out and keeping us straight. So thank you for that. And also Brian Lewandowski, who helped to organize this roundtable from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Keep an eye out at AUBER.org. We'll post all the information from this webinar there. You can see information from past webinars, and then also we'll be making future announcements for future roundtables at that point. So I hope that everyone has a wonderful weekend coming up. Hopefully you're in a place where you can enjoy some sunshine and enjoy the spring. And we'll look forward to seeing you all in roundtables over the next couple of months, and then hopefully at our in-person event in the new year. So thanks everyone, take care.